So we've been looking at the Book of Assistance, and if people want to pull that up on their phones, you can just do a Google search, the Book of Assistance PDF. It's written by Imam Al-Haddad, rahimahullah, and it's a text on spirituality. It presents to the reader very easily digestible chapters. They're quite short in length, anywhere from a page to a handful of pages. There's a couple that are a little longer than that, but the majority of them are in these very concise, deliberately short chapters. And they create a roadmap to spirituality, essentially, for the one who's engaging the text. Right? Islam as a religion doesn't divorce spirituality, religion, and ethics and see them as things that are separate, but sees them as necessary components that overlap to formulate the entire religion on a whole. And within the prism of spirituality, if we were to give it a definition at a baseline, essentially what spirituality offers to the one who engages and increases it is a capacity to ascertain meaning from the environment around them. Right? The idea being that there's opportunity to take signs from the world around you, to find what's inherently beautiful and what's inherently good. And it gets juxtaposed in terms of the manner in which we can acquire this kind of knowledge to other prongs of knowledge in Islam as a tradition, in that if we were to not look at Islam as the name of the religion, but Islam as practice and ritual, and a second prong that is Iman, or faith, principles of theology and doctrine, these are things that you can memorize rotely. Ihsan, which is quite often the terminology utilized for Islamic spirituality, is an experiential knowledge. Right? It's not something that you just kind of learn and memorize, but it necessitates an intimacy and an implementation and engagement in order for there to be increase in it. So what does that all mean? Right? Essentially, how you see something isn't necessarily telling you about what you're looking at, but how you see something tells you a lot about yourself. And that's both in terms of how you see the world around you, how you see the world in and of itself, as well as how you see yourself. It's giving indication in terms of what you're harboring within and what you're giving abode within. An Islamic framework of the self and a psychological framework of the self isn't limited to quite often what we understand ourselves holistically to be. Right? So you have a physical body, it's called the jasad, the badan in Arabic, but that's your body, right? Hands, head, stomach, torso, legs, feet. Within, there's things that also exist. The intellect is called the aql, and the Quran invites you to utilize it pretty much on every page that you read in it. It's the ability to discern right from wrong within a divine imperative, right? An intellectual capacity. You have what's called the qalb, the spiritual heart. It is meant to be sovereign when you're in a high spiritual state. You have the nafs, the lower self, the ego, which is in a constant state of battle with the heart. You have what's called irada, or sheer will and determination. And these things all exist within you, just as all of your feelings, your memories, your experiences, everything that you've been blessed to have in your life, everything that's been difficult to have in your life, all of these things exist within you in some capacity, and they inform now vision and perspective. Right? The sadness that you felt yesterday is going to impact how you see the world. The relationship that worked out or did not work out, that's going to impact how you see the world. An elder in your life that either told you they loved you or did not tell you that they loved you, the presence or absence of those things is going to impact how you see the world. People express gratitude or they fail to express gratitude. They let you feel like there was value to your presence or they just were dismissive or kind of ignored your existence. People apologize or they fail to apologize. All of these things impact inwardly, and what's inward then impacts how we understand what is both outward and inward. And what this text does is it offers a roadmap in easily digestible chapters to say, well, how do you both understand and rebuild a higher level of inner self? So that when you're traversing the world, it doesn't mean that you don't feel things that are heavy, but that heaviness can still coexist with a sense of balance and contentment. That you're able to exist in a way where there's still a sense of meaning, there's still a sense of upliftment, there's still an opportunity to see what is there as opposed to a prism of what's not there. There's not a paradigm of inadequacy or inefficiency or deficiency, that's a worldview, but a sense of a glass half full versus half empty, right? All of that is through a vision of the heart. And the notion here is, well, how do we cultivate a relationship with the heart? How do we build out technique, concept, theory, practical implementation of advices and counsels that allow for us to move forward in a way where we're not just feeding the body, but we're feeding what also needs to be nourished, and that's the inner self. Does that make sense? And what our theology posits, rooted in our tradition, is that with modernity, there's a diminishing of that kind of perspective. We have, similar to other religious traditions, apocalyptic and eschatological genres within our tradition, like end of times narratives. And within the context of the end of times, there's a figure that is known to be kind of as an antichrist figure, known as Dajjal. May Allah protect us from his fitna, his trial. And of the depictions of Dajjal, he is said to be one-eyed. And in the most literal sense, that contradicts what Quranic verse says. In Surah Al-Balad, there's a verse that says, Alam naj'al lahu aynayn, that did we not make him with two eyes, right? You have two eyes on your face, and Dajjal is going to be one-eyed, the hadith says. And so in the most literal sense, that's the idea, that Dajjal is a being that comes at the end of time. He's going to have one eye. In a more esoteric sense, the idea is that at the end of time, meaning within the prism of modernity, as we get closer to end of times, that one eye esoterically is not in a literal sense, but in a sense that vision becomes limited, that we are meant to be people who have the capacity to be able to see outward and inward, not just in one direction, but in both directions. And with this idea, as time passes, people are going to only be able to see in one direction, either outward or inward, not both. There'll be an absence of depth of perspective. You're not going to be able to really find the contentment that comes from being able to see a person as a whole person and not just one single variable of their identity. It's going to be easy to make simplistic and reductive kind of understandings when you intellectualize people's struggles. And the opportunity to find meaning, not just in what is success, but also failure. Not just in what is ease, but also difficulty. The ability to be able to get through whatever it is, whether it's a challenge or whether it's a moment of comfort, it all roots itself in this. The challenge that comes up for a lot of us is that religion in and of itself, especially one that has ritual, has the danger of becoming overtly ritualized. And for a lot of us, whether we're born into Islam or we convert to Islam, what we're given quite often primarily are just that, the do's and don'ts, the rights and wrongs, the black and white of it. And it becomes reduced now to this notion that there's not this as a means to something, it's just an ends. So you see a lot of people who pray, but they're praying with their body and not praying with their heart. Their body's prostrate, but the heart does not prostrate, right? You think, how can somebody wake up to pray Fajr every day of their life and they're still mean to people? How can somebody go to Jummah every single week and somehow justify abusing somebody? The correlation between the outward and the inward becomes limited when the only focus is on the outward. It's not that it's not a necessary part, but it's not the only part. And when you only have that, it becomes problematic. And just to recap, because we haven't met in a few weeks. So what our tradition does, the example that I like to utilize, it's a dimensional engagement of religion. And what a lot of us have is just one dimension, which is practice, which is called Islam. And if you only have one dimension, whatever you're looking at is going to look like this. It's just going to be one straight line. That's it. That's what a one-dimensional understanding of the world looks like. If this is what Islam means to you, all you know is how to pray, and all you know is how to fast, and that's all you've ever learned, let alone knowing even the entirety of the line, the other rituals and practices that come into play, the rules of zakah, the rules of hajj, the rules of whatever is relevant to your professional life, the current phase of life that you're in. If all you have is that practice, whatever you look at is just going to be one-dimensional. And so what our tradition does, this is my credit card, I'm not going to put that on camera. What our tradition does is it adds a second dimension, which is theology. And you put that on a vertical, and now the line has shape to it. So you go from one dimension to two dimension, and you can take more meaning from it. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? Doesn't this look different from this? So if all you have is this, that's why religion feels the way it feels. You want it to feel a little differently, you gotta add this other dimension. This is what Iman does, faith, theology. It now takes the line and gives it shape. It's a rectangle, it's a diamond, it's a square, but you can draw more meaning from it. And then what we're discussing, spirituality, that adds now a third dimension. And that's what brings depth and volume, right? You see this thing, and I see it, but neither of us sees it the same way. All of us literally in the room right now sees it from a different vantage point. None of you are sitting exactly where the rest of you are seated. And if we were to identify and define where and how this relates to you from your point of perspective, it would all be different from every single one of the rest of us, but none of it is better or worse or right or wrong. It's all still valid. And that's what Ihsan does. It allows for you to understand that many things can be seen on 360 degrees of perspective on almost an infinite number of planes. The husn, the innate beauty inwardly of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, allowed for him to see something the way he saw it and understand why someone else would see it the way that they saw it without him having to become them. And then you can look at things, problem solve. There's always a way out of something. But if I only see it myopically, exhausted, tired, why is the prayer not changing what it is that I'm engaged in? Well, if you're only at one-dimensional understanding, then that's what you're bringing to it. And then people will give to you only what it is that they possess in the first place. So somebody walked in here and they said to you, teach me about Islam. What would you tell them? If you had the task of explaining this religion to somebody who came in here, assuming they have a baseline understanding of it, and they said, tell me about this religion, what would you give to them? At the juncture that I'm in right now, I don't have to go in thinking that I'm not equipped with certain tools and arsenal, because it's a simple religion. The entry bar is not up here, it's down here. You don't want to mute what God has endowed you with innately in order to understand it. Hey, you want to take her upstairs? Medina and Kareem are on the third floor. Okay. Yeah? And then you can come back down. No problem. It's my friend Jay and Samira. Samira did not come to hang out with us. She came to hang out with her friends. And so this text necessitates not just reading it, but acting upon it. And at the point of religious experience that we're all in respectively, being able to wrestle with the idea inwardly through reflection and contemplation that starts from this notion of vision. Why do I see things in the ways that I see them? What are the gaps that are informing my perspective? How do I make sense of the world? When do I stop to take a moment to find stillness? Why is it that the things that bother me bother me? Why is it that the things that make me happy make me happy? How can I see anything and everything in the world as a sign point for something that is a reminder of what comes after this world, versus what just confines me to this worldly existence? Because forget about seeing outwardly or inwardly. I'm just running on default settings. I'm not even looking at anything around me. I don't pay attention to anything that's going on. It's just the same day again and again and again. And I miss out on the opportunity to be able to find joy in things that are quite simple, but they don't need such complexity to be a source of actual rejuvenation. So I know that what makes me distinct from the rest of creation, I should embrace and not mute. Because the birds, they don't know how beautiful their song is. The sun, it doesn't know how beautiful it looks when it rises or it sets. We have been endowed with the ability to perceive. That's what makes humans different from the rest of creation. We also have intellectual capacity. We can think prior to what we do. And the ability to think in relation to perception is something that we have, that other aspects of creation do not have. But where and how it ties into this text is about enlightening that vision of the heart and allowing for us to embed spirituality as something that's not just, within the framework of more contemporary jargon, things that are very loosely defined, but there can be specific steps and structures to enhance the spiritual self. And so we're on chapter 10. We've been looking at each of these chapters very succinctly, going through them piece by piece, so that we can just extrapolate meaning from them and try to take from them as best as we can. For those who haven't been here before, what we try to do is break up the kind of talking by engaging in conversation and discussion. So where and how you're comfortable talking to the people around you. You don't want to limit yourself by only speaking what you think is most correct, or avoiding saying something that you feel like does not make any sense. Nor do you want to jump to remedy somebody else's words. That's not the way that we can broaden in our sense of perspective. But you want to both listen to understand empathetically and create a space where people can express ideas and opinions. Quite often in religious spaces, it's very front-facing, and you're just told this is what it is without the opportunity to opine and to offer viewpoints and give insights that help all of us to benefit. You want to get comfortable, right? A lot of Muslims, they're afraid to talk about who God is to them. They don't ever talk about God. That's why they just talk about the black and white of ritual and practice and weaponize it to be able to gauge why somebody else isn't really doing it, quote unquote, as best as they can. But where and how everything fundamentally goes back to God in this religion, if you've never had a conversation about who God is to you, then where would your religion be at this point? Within it also, it's just a way for us to get to know each other a little bit better, right? We pray together, we share meals together, we build community together. We want to be able to start also understanding each other at a deeper level and hearing each other's ideas and hearing each other's perspectives so we can grow together inwardly as well as outwardly. So if you've missed the first kind of set of classes that we've been doing on this, all of it's online and you can engage it on YouTube, podcasts, etc. And we're on chapter 10. So this chapter is on following the book, meaning the Quran and Sunnah, And it comes now after a series of chapters that were on what was called a wird, having a daily litany, but it's about bringing structure and routine to your day, right? So the 5th chapter on awrad, having a wird, is really about connecting the idea of time management to self-management. Because so many of us just engage in things spontaneously, right? And we kind of move in different ways. And what Imam Al-Haddad is saying is that a way to increase blessing in your day is to just have structure, and you're making time, not just for what is purely worship oriented, because that's not how anybody lives. But you got to make time to hang out with your friends. You got to make time to take care of your physical wellness. You got to make time for your sleep and for your eating. You got to make time for your professional ambitions. And you make time for your prayer, your recitation of Quran, your adhkar. And then he breaks down the wird into other chapters, saying that you recite the Quran, you engage in practices of acquiring knowledge regularly, that you are engaged in regular practices of remembrance and reflection. And these were the handful of chapters that preceded this book, this chapter on following the Sunnah and following the Quran. So if people can pull up chapter 10, it's probably page 36 in most of your PDFs. And if you don't have it in front of you, you can just Google the Book of Assistance PDF, Imam Al-Haddad. And can somebody start reading from the first sentence? You must hold fast to the book and the Sunnah. Yeah, go ahead.
You must hold fast to the book and the Sunnah. Take refuge in them, for they are the upright religion of God and His straight path. Those who adhere to them find safety, profit, guidance, and protection, while those who deviate from them go astray, grieve, lose, and are broken. Let them govern you and control what you do, and consult them in your every affair, in obedience to the counsel of God and that His messenger. O you who believe, obey God and obey the messenger, and those in authority among you. If you have a dispute concerning any matter, refer it to God and the messenger. If you believe in God and the last day, that is better and fair of consequence.
Keep going.
Refer it to God and the messenger means refer it to the book and Sunnah. The messenger of God, may blessings and peace be upon him, has said, I bid you take care of that with which, if you hold to it firmly, you will never err. The book of God and my Sunnah. If it pleases you to be well guided along the white road in which there is neither crookedness nor curvature, then measure all your intentions, traits, acts, and words against the book and Sunnah. Then retain whatever conforms to them and abandon whatever does not. And always be cautious and follow the better alternative. Never innovate in religion, nor follow the ways of the non-believers, or else you will lose both this world and the hereafter. Which thing is the manifest loss? Beware of the novel things and the invented opinions, and for he has said, may blessings and peace be upon him. Every addition is an innovation. Every innovation is an error. And anyone who adds to this affair of ours what does not belong to it is to be rejected.
Okay, so this chapter is not about just the importance of the Quran and the Hadith, but it's interjecting a concept that we want to be able to break down in a few different ways, because in comparison to when this text is written and previous texts, you have a lot of contemporary discourse on this topic of innovation, which in Arabic is called bid'ah, that also conflates the discussion in ways that can be quite confusing. And there's a bunch of different ways that this concept is understood, but we want to understand what the chapter is about in the first place and give a definition to what this is. So Imam Al-Haddad, he's saying this now and placing it after he talks about things like reflection and adhkar and engaging in the acquisition of knowledge and all kinds of practices. The understanding is that the innovation that he's telling you to avoid is one that is in particular to innovated matters in religion. That the idea is that you want to remember that the base of this religion is that we do have a Quran and we do have a Sunnah. The word bid'ah in and of itself has a literal meaning and a technical meaning, right? And a lot of words that we learn that are words in Arabic, just like in English, you can understand them through connotations, denotations, literal meanings, technical meanings. So the word, for example, Sharia, which refers to Islamic law, both civil and criminal aspects of it, in its most literal definition, it means a path to water. The word sunnah literally just refers to the authoritative example of anyone. Its technical definition refers to the authoritative example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So the word bid'ah just means anything that's new, anything that's like newly invented. The technical definition religiously refers to now a matter that is newly innovated, relevant to religious matters, in matters of religion only. Why is this important? Because you will have individuals who might tell you if something didn't happen during the time of the Prophet, you can't do it. So no laptops, no cars, right? These are not things that existed at that time. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about purely in the context of religious undertoned activities. That there's nothing that you have to add on as such, because all of it is there in the Quran and in the Hadith. Like, you don't have to invent a new way to pray. You don't have to invent a new form of, worship in that sense. Does that make sense? Why do you think this is something that is important for someone to know? Like, why is Imam Al-Haddad giving this as its own chapter in this text? Because it's a different leap now, right? He went from a set of chapters that were about actual things that you could practice, the recitation of Quran on a daily basis. You want to do some form of regular acquisition of knowledge in your daily routines, your regular routines. You want to do regular remembrance, dhikr of Allah. You want to be in a place where you have moments of solitude and reflection. And now he's interjecting something that is a concept that's telling you, hey, be careful about this thing. Why? What is its relevance to me? Me just trying to be everyday person, worshiping God as best as I can. What does this have to do with me? Something that is a newly invented matter in religion. What does that mean to me? Why do I have to think about this? Does the question make sense? If you can turn to the persons next to you, if you don't know their names yet, introduce yourselves. What is the relevancy here? What do we want to think about at the baseline level as to why this is something that is mentioned in the hadith? Why is this something that we want to be thinking about in terms of just our relationship to religion? And then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Okay. So, why is this an important thing to understand? Like, why would we want to individually, how does this relate to any of the things we've been discussing, or what are some of the things that come to mind that one would want to be thinking about in this matter? What did you discuss? Yeah.
So we talked about how it is important to be reminded about the sanctity of our holy book and the traditions, and it's really not our place to be adding to it. And also, our conversation deviated to how, back to your first question, that if someone had asked, what can you tell me about Islam? Some of us have some insecurities about talking about it just because we don't feel like we have that proper training to teach. we could say, oh, you can follow me and shadow me and see what I do, but there is this reluctance that teaching should be left to people who know what they're talking about.
Okay. But if I did something that was new, why would that be a problem? Yeah.
So we talked about the idea of like if you just added something new one day, you were like, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. And the next day you add something new, oh, it's not that big of a deal. All of a sudden you make up your own religion, right? And we talked a bit about like different religions over time. So you have like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They all had prophets that came to say like, hey, this is the right way you should be practicing. Don't go astray. And then over time, people were like adding on by little, have their own religions, and then a new prophet came and was like, no, let's come back. So if we continue doing our own thing over time, we'll just be practicing a whole other religion. It's like, what was the point? When also, if you can correct me, isn't it like the new program like finalize he was the end, right? Like he finalized the religion, corrected it with the Quran. So we have no right to be adding anything new.
Yeah, and these both are like good points. Let's keep them in mind and see how they relate. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was listening to this podcast that was talking about objective reality and how there is no limit to objective reality. So if we just like keep on adding things, there is just no limit to how much we can add to it and how much we can tweak it and alter it. Which means that we are always gonna find something new and always gonna be lost. Whereas Islam, Quran, and Sunnah is like a complete blueprint for us to follow. But if we get into objective reality, which has no limit, we're just gonna be lost.
So why would people over time change their own religions? Right? Like if you read texts that are purely academic texts, you could read The Sociology of Religion by Max Weber. Right? He's not Muslim. He's an academic. He will tell you how the church, he will tell you how various religions, objective, like historically, the religion is changed. The manner in which the institutional structures, they exist, they change. The systems, they change. Different things change. Why? Why is that something that potentially comes to play? Why does that happen? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask you to talk about this. One of the reasons individually we're also not wanting to add newly invented matters in these things is because they're not going to do anything for you. Right? Like up until this juncture, everything that we're talking about, I don't know why there's 2 cycles of prayer for Fajr that are obligatory and 2 that are recommended. As much as why I couldn't tell you there's 3 obligatory cycles for Maghrib. But Allah, in His infinite wisdom, has said, this is the best way to worship me. When you have a religion that is God-centric, it doesn't function only off of principles of rationality and irrationality. Something makes sense to me or something does not make sense to me. There's a realm of supra-rational that says I don't have to understand it in order for it to be true, meaning that Allah's knowledge and wisdom is greater than mine. So I don't know why we pray 3 rak'ahs at Maghrib versus 6 rak'ahs. But if somebody tomorrow came and said, praying 6 is better, based on what? And it's an exercise. Just like you have physical exercise, if you don't do the exercise right, it's going to not impact you in the ways that is beneficial. So any of you in this room do any kind of physical exercise, you know that if you are off slightly, it might not make that much of a difference. But if you do it again and again repetitively, the wrong motion, you don't engage it in its correct posture, you can actually hurt yourself over time. A spiritual exercise is not that different. Somebody tomorrow said, why do you fast from dawn till dusk? Because that's just the way Allah said to do it. So when the companions of the Prophet who said to him, we're just not going to eat, we're not going to sleep, we're not going to get married. And he says to them that I fast and I also don't fast. I sleep at night. I'm married. You think you can do this better than me? Or somebody says to you something like, I know I'm sick, but I'm going to still fast because that means I'll get more reward for it. Where does that come from? Where does that notion come from? It might come from insecurity. It might come from Muslims being in your business and not letting you be comfortable not fasting because you're sick or you're on your menstrual cycle or whatever. But fundamentally, the notion that says there's more merit to it in a certain way is actually where it's flawed on individual practice. Do you get what I mean? You're putting your time into an action that isn't going to render for you the benefit that you think it's going to render. You can't invent a different way of doing Hajj. You just do Hajj the way Hajj is supposed to be done. If somebody said, I'm going to start making pilgrimage to Mexico, right? Go make a pilgrimage to Mexico. No offense, Luna. But if you go and you say religiously there's some basis to it, you just wasted a lot of time going to do something because we don't worship feelings in Islam. Just because it feels a certain way, that's not what you're worshiping. You're worshiping the God who gave you your feelings in the first place. Do you get what I mean? And so the idea of changing and creating and building your own religion, or forgetting that there's a base, a framework, there is a Quran, there's a Sunnah, there's guidelines, there's structures. It's not always easy. A God-centric religion is going to assume that there's certain things that God asked you to do, that you love to do, certain things God asked you to do, that you struggle with, certain things that you might not understand. You just try your best with it. But rooted in all of this is this idea that you can either have a religion that renders you submissive to God, or you can have a religion that renders God submissive to you. And if you are going to practice religion in a way that makes God subservient to you, then you're not practicing Islam. Because Islam is about yielding to the idea that the only thing that's worthy of worship is God. A God that believes in me more than I believe in myself. A God that loves me more than a mother loves his child. A God that is not just watching me, but watching over me. But in this idea, in the engagement of now what is newly innovated, what are you going to come up with? And what is it going to actually render for you? Does that make sense? That's the part of the challenge here. And all of these things come into play. The idea that you're fundamentally just at that point inadvertently at the cusp of making your own religion. And where and how that can be your prerogative, but then you just recognize that that's what I'm doing fundamentally. I'd like for you to talk about this objectively. Don't talk about it judgmentally. Because if you talk about it judgmentally, you're not going to be able to then draw from it principle or idea that gives an opportunity to learn from something that has historical precedence to it. Why would somebody seek to change their religion? What would come up for people? Why do they change their theology? Why do they change their ritual? Why do they change their practice? Why are these things that might come up for communities, for other traditions, for even people who claim to practice Islam? Why might they start to say, well, here is a reason as to why we need to make it different? What is the thing? Because when Imam Al-Haddad is saying, don't start following what other people do, because this is what they did. The notion isn't to look down on people of other faith traditions, but to be able to understand objectively that religions in and of themselves, from their initial forms, they change. This is not a religion that is without text and context relationship. There are elements of continuity and elements of change within our religion. It's not something that practices this rugged form of individualism that says we exist in a homogeneity that makes no sense. Islam in China looks Chinese. Islam in Malaysia looks Malaysian. Islam in Sudan looks Sudanese. Islam in America looks like Islam everywhere because we have people from everywhere. Look at all of you. That's not what's being said here. It's not saying that we all just look like cookie cutter shapes of one another and we're all exactly the same. We're all different. The companions were all different from each other. Umar ibn al-Khattab did not have the same demeanor as Uthman ibn Affan or Ali ibn Abi Talib or Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. They were all different people. They had different strengths and non-strengths. They had different characteristics. They had different personalities. If they were all meant to be the same, the religion would not make any sense because God is the creator of diversity in the first place. So understanding this concept still becomes important though, because there's very few obligations in Islam and very few prohibitions in comparison to the multitude of things that are permissible. Why would this be something that happens historically? What would compel people to seek to change the religions that they were given, right? Kiara is saying there are religions that came before, they started to change things. New prophets were sent to remind people, come back to these ideas. What's going on that would compel someone to change religion from what it was intended to be? If you could turn to the people next to you and talk about it, and then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things you're coming up with, right? Objectively, not judgmentally. Why might people's change, like their religions that they have? Just as a point before we start, because it's a big room, when you're talking, just enunciate in a way, speaking tip, as if you're talking. Why are your hands? Why are you so excited? What?
We're just teasing each other.
You're teasing each other?
We're like, what do you think first?
I'm not picking either of you. So, talk in a way where you're trying to speak to the person sitting farthest away from you so that your voice carries over. A couple of reminders. We're going to have dinner here after Maghrib, so whether you're fasting or not, stick around and eat. People are asking if the two Burmese women who usually make iftar for us and dinner are cooking for tonight. They're not, mashallah. If you didn't know, the last few iftars that we had were made by these two women on their own. They cooked everything, brought it down from their home, mashallah. Make special dua for them. The older auntie and her daughter that were cooking for us, mashallah. Yeah, may Allah bless them for that and everything they were doing. So we're going to have Domino's tonight. It's a big shift from handmade, home-cooked. Yeah. But then next week, we'll probably order something else. I just forgot to order food. I'm not going to lie to you. That's why we're having pizza today. Yeah. It's potluck also, so for those, we're going to start coming around again. If you want to bring something for people to snack on, it's fine, but it's not necessary to bring something. But just stick around after, because it's always great to have people get to talk, get to know each other over some food. So plan to stay after Maghrib time. So what did you come up with? Why are people prone to doing this? Why might someone look to have change in their religion? Yeah, Maria, go ahead.
I think it's maybe like misinformation or incomplete information, especially at a time when we're with the internet. People with incomplete knowledge would just spread it to the families, communities, or figure out, would just give the wrong information to his family, to his extended family, and then that would just progress through the generations, and next thing you know, it's part of the culture and the religion.
Yeah, it could be a mistake, right? That's pretty valid, right? Someone just by accident started something. What else? Yeah, Shala.
I think sometimes we change religion to serve us instead of serving it.
But why? Like, in being able to think about intentionality and motivation. You're not judging someone,
Yeah.
but thinking, like, what would compel someone to do that? Do you have your hand raised in the back? Yeah. Go ahead.
I feel like it could be for personal gain or for growth or even political gain.
How? Can you flesh that out?
I'm not 100% sure on this, but like I heard that like some of the beef were tweaked around and stuff because the Sunni and Shias were having a war at the time.
Okay. Yeah. Bradley, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, I brought up the topic of convenience within religion and how some base desires may conflict with religious obligations or prohibitions, and as little as there may be things that are prohibited or allowed within Islam, like say someone, well, I don't want to give a specific example, but yeah, I mean, as opposed to maybe directly addressing a habit that may be in opposition to Islam or what Islam expects of its followers, you maybe work around that as opposed to addressing a habit or
Yeah.
So one of the things we discussed in our group was the fact that like values of society change over time. And, like in any society, the values can change over time. Like even in America, like over the last 30 years, we're seeing that like values are changing a lot, and then that leads to overcompensation in both directions. So in one direction, you could be a little bit more strict and like add things to the religion to sort of defend yourself against societal change. And the other direction is like you conform to societal change and you try to like fit in with like the changes in values and you stop thinking of religion as like a sort of objective set of values. So you have.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's also associated with power and authority. For example, in Pakistan, there are like a lot of religious organizations who kind of change the way that Islam is, and I think it's more like the lust of power and authority that they get from it. Like they like people following them into something that's very unrelated to Islam, and they make money out of it as well. And I think they benefit off of uneducated people, especially in Pakistan and in South Asia. So yeah, the politics, power, and authority plays a big role.
So when you think about all of these things together, it's not easy, right? Like you can imagine there's individuals that have competing interests. People who don't buy into a theology, but are more opportunistic. Individuals who start to also, on the other end, make religion very difficult, right? A lot of people turn away from religion because of quote-unquote religious people. This is where the idea is that you're not looking to break down a person, but necessarily perhaps maybe break down a condition or a tendency, you know? So you have scholars of the past who had their students that they would go at odds with. And when they would have dispute, the senior scholar would go to the younger scholar and try to figure out what was going on in terms of the conflict, and they would reach a conclusion where the sheikh says to the student, our job is not to obliterate the patient, our job is to obliterate the illness. The whole idea is to not destroy an individual. You still have a certain sense of sanctity for the person. But you can recognize that when somebody is in a place where they're not feeling right inside, they don't have community support. They're in a place where the world gets heavy. You live in a society that tells you who you are is only acceptable when you become that which you are not. You live in a deeply entrenched anti-blackness. Whiteness, white supremacy constantly creates a good-bad framework. There's hadith that say towards the end of time, holding on to a sunnah is going to be like holding on to a flaming coal in your hand. It's not going to be easy. But there's a difference between struggling versus saying this is now just how it is always, absolutely. A concept you have to understand here is what's called the maqasid sharia, the objectives of Islamic law. That it's not a system that is just in a vacuum, but there's purpose to it. The implementation of the command towards doing what is good and forbidding what is wrong is a divine command, but its implementation gets suspended when it increases detriment and not benefit. So why does Umar ibn al-Khattab suspend the had punishment, the penal code punishment for stealing during his caliphate? Because people are starving, they don't have food to eat. What are they going to do? This is where the system is not something that is beyond an understanding of what's going on practically on the ground, but a recognition that the base of this comes from just actually knowing what the book says. And it's not a self-deprecating question. It could be, but it chooses what it is based off of how you speak it to yourself. How much of the Quran do you read? And understanding that your Islam is not an inherited identity, but it's a discursive theology that you have to be able to think about, well, why do you practice Islam? And if somebody can come and turn your religion into something that it's not. I don't know if I said in this halaqa or a different halaqa that we do, but we went to Palestine before COVID hit. Did any of you come on that trip? Abir, you were on the trip, right? We went to Palestine and all over, right? May Allah end the occupation there and make us a generation that sees a free Palestine in our lives. There is historical narrative rooted in the telling of prophetic experience that contradicts what our religious understanding is in relation to the sites on the ground in the Holy Lands. And what people in authority seek to do in order to now validate what becomes politically inequitous policy and practice, they take advantage of the fact that you don't know your religion. And they tell you this is what your religion actually says. To advance now what becomes apartheid and oppression of people. Do you get what I mean? And why community is necessary in all of this. Why you need to be kind. Why you need to be generous. Why you have to check in on people. Because you have companions of the Prophet who struggled with drinking alcohol. You have companions of the Prophet who struggled with committing zina. This is not just something that is meant to be clever or anything. It's real. They weren't saying it's a part of the religion. They're saying this is something that I have difficulty with. Even moving beyond the tendency and propensity of it and actually engaging in the act. They still had a place within Islam. Do you get what I mean? When there's not consciousness, why this is built in a text of spirituality, if your heart is not awake, you're going to think the thoughts that you're thinking are your own thoughts, but in reality, the thoughts that you think are the thoughts that the system wants you to think. You're going to buy into supremacist ideology, and whiteness is going to define and dictate your sense of self, and it's going to tell you to forego parts of who you are and buy into practices and thoughts that are still defined and dictated by people of privilege that don't want you to be empowered through what is a robust religious identity. You got to be proud to pray your prayers. not feel like you're walking on eggshells. And that can be hard for the individual, but it's that much harder when they walk into a room and nobody says salam to them. That you're in a place and you can stand side by side with somebody in prayer and not even know their name. And they go each and every day walking into spaces where they are around people who don't invite them to celebrate holidays with them, talk poorly about them, don't let them marry their children, engage in all kinds of behaviors that the soul gets weary and wear down. And it says, well, if I'm not going to be accepted by the people that claim to be my brothers and sisters, where am I going to go? And if this guy on the pulpit is constantly telling me why I'm destined for hell, why would I want to be a part of the religion in this way? Knowing the base becomes important. Just because somebody, quote unquote, looks religious doesn't mean that they know religion. There's a lot of conversations I have with people when we sit down. And I know the kind of things, alhamdulillah, that I have skills at. When I sit down and I talk with people, I'm talking with them and listening to them. But I can tell you the sheer number of times I've sat down with people, elders, various places. They are on their deen in a lot of different ways, but it gets to a point where what they're saying fundamentally is not part of this religion. It is not part of this religion to reject a suitor based off of their racial background. And when you get to a place where all you can then verbalize is my culture takes precedence over my religion, then that's fine. That's what you're doing, man. Do you get what I mean? You're not adding benefit to your life by making religion submissive to you. Another principle we want to think about before we go through the rest of this, it is a sign of spiritual immaturity to believe that you know every opinion on every matter. So you are going to inevitably meet people who do things differently from you. And they will have evidences, they will have basis to it. The challenge that comes is that you have extremes. On one extreme, it's let me make religion into whatever I want it to be. On the other extreme is you're making religion into something that it shouldn't be. The first time I did etikaf, I was 19 years old, and Ramadan was during Christmas time at that time. That's how old I am. And over the Christmas break, the masjid was filled with a lot of people who were on school holidays, and I was sleeping. Itikaf is a practice of a spiritual retreat. In the last 10 nights of Ramadan, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would seek solitude in the masjid. It's an amazing experience. I pray inshallah all of you get to do it. It's really, really remarkable. You're not away from people, you're away from distractions. You're just consuming what is good. Good for your body, good for your soul, good for your heart. You're not hearing lies and backbiting and gossiping and people being condescending. You're just consuming things that are just good for you. So in the masjid that I was doing this in, I was sleeping near a window during the winter, and a lot of people were sleeping towards the middle of the masjid, but I just wanted my own space, right? And I started to get sick. I'm fasting. I wasn't like overtly sick, but I was coughing up a lot of phlegm. When you're in etikaf, you're just sitting in the masjid all day. You don't leave the masjid unless there's a viable reason to leave the masjid. So I got a paper cup and I started spitting my phlegm in the cup. You can think it's gross, because it is gross. But that's what I was doing. And then a guy came up to me. He's a really nice guy that I'd known for a few months, had only started to get into his deen again within a few months, born into Islam. And the people he was sitting with were people who were really hypersensitive on this concept of bid'ah. And this guy comes and sits next to me, and I'd known him for a few months, really nice, always smiling. I'm spitting in my cup, He was like, how's it going? I was like, well, I'm spitting a cup a lot, man. What do you think it's like? And he's like, are you sick? I was like, no, I just do this for fun. And he was like, I don't think you should do this. And initially I was like, yeah, it's pretty gross. But he was like, this is bid'ah. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, the Prophet didn't do this. The companions didn't do this. I was like, the Prophet and the companions didn't spit in a cup? Like, this isn't what the word means. Do you get what I mean? But a little bit of information can tweak the ego in a place that you now have a prism in front of you that starts to make claims that are just nonsensical. And when your mode of engagement of religion is one that seeks to break down others as a means of bringing yourself up, it's not a good intention, man. You're hurting yourself more than you're hurting anybody else. And that's why you have to know Islam. You don't have to just practice Islam. You don't want to just be Muslim by an identity variable. Hey Kareemu, assalamu alaikum. This is my son Kareem, mashallah. Kareem is in a 7-hour-a-day basketball camp right now. So if his guns are looking bigger, it's because he's grabbing those rebounds really hard. You tired? What are you doing down here? Did you say assalamu alaikum to everyone? Yeah? Well, Kareem, I guess, is going to sit right here for the rest of the night. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? So somebody tells you something is haram, and you don't know what the word haram means. I love each of you. I know some of you have never had a conversation with me. The people who have been here for a while, they'll tell you, I'm genuine in saying, I love you. How do you not know what the word haram means? If I asked each of you to tell me the definition of the word, most of you would not be able to tell me what it means. And then somebody's going to come and say to you, well, this is haram and that's haram. What is that going to do for you? If you see this religion just as something that's in name and not as a reality, if it doesn't inform your decisions, your choices, it's something you do here and not over here, not because it's hard when it's over here, but through convenience. It's something that you embody. That knowledge base becomes important. So then you practice it in the way that it's intended to be practiced. You know why you're doing what you're doing. You don't let people come and make it something that it's not supposed to be. And then you don't get in people's faces when you see something that's different from the way that you've seen it done before. Because you don't know everything. And that's okay. You're not supposed to know everything. Who can possibly know everything? That's a futile pursuit. You just gotta know simple things. Be nice to people. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Right? Make excuses for people. And work hard on yourself. That's what spirituality is. Mujahida. You're struggling with something. You get what I mean? This is why it's important to know that this thing is not something that is a concept we want to be dismissive of. To be able to recognize it. That it can lead to a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. Let's continue on with reading. On page 37, he says there are 3 kinds of innovations. Does anybody want to read? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
There are 3 kinds of innovations. The first is a good innovation, which is that which the well-guided leaders have opinion in conformity with the book and sunnah, intending to choose that which is more beneficial, more useful, and finer. As for example, Abu Bakr's collection of the whole Quran into one volume, Umar's institution of military pension and of the Tarawih prayer, Uthman's arrangement of the Quran, and the institution of the first call to prayer on Friday, and Ali's rules for fighting heretical rebels. May God bestow his good pleasure upon the 4 caliphs.
Okay, so there is hadith where the Prophet ﷺ expands on this idea of bid'ah, right? And by extension, he's saying that where and how you take understanding, you take from me, you take from the kind of predecessors after me. He's giving an idea that this extends past his immediate generation. So these examples have principles that are rooted now in an idea that just because something didn't happen immediately in the time of the Prophet doesn't mean that that's something that isn't a part of the religion. So Uthman ibn Affan, for example, he adds another adhan on the day of Jummah. But what's happening contextually is that the Muslim community has grown from this to this. And when the community is this big and the adhan is called when the imam is on the mimbar, like everybody can hear it. We call the adhan in this room, what's going to happen? You can all hear it. But the person sitting on the other end of the building, they're not going to be able to get here in the same way you can get here. So Uthman ibn Affan, he says, let's add an adhan that calls out into the marketplace, that doesn't have any legal implications as such, but it proceeds now and it gives people who are coming from a distance time to come in. Or they make the decision to extend the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, the masjid in Mecca. If you see pictures of the original Kaaba, you see pictures of the Rawda, if you've never been there, the original masjid is not so large. But now when you go and there's 1 million people, the actual construction is to accommodate more people. They're adding on to the masjid. Does that make sense? When Umar radiallahu anh sees people praying Taraweeh, it's after the Prophet has not institutionalized congregational prayer, because during his time, when people came to pray behind him, he noticed that they were coming. And then they came other nights and he wasn't there. And then when he came out again, they said, what happened to you? He said, I didn't want you to think that this was an obligation. I didn't want it to be difficult for you. Ease is the basis of all of this. And so when Umar is Khalifa, he sees now people praying in multiple jama'ahs in the same space, and he says, let's all pray together. This is what they're calling a bid'ah hasana, like a good innovation. Those who follow this methodology, that say that the term bid'ah can be understood in multiple categories, they use a hadith that says, if somebody was to establish something that was good and people were to follow them, then there'd be good in that for them. If somebody was to establish something that's not good, then there would be, and people follow them in that, then there would not be good in them. Those who say no, bid'ah is just completely in and of itself always a problem, they're not debating that these things were good things to do. They're just saying you can't use the term to apply to it. It becomes a distinction point between individuals who would be categorically defined more as part of a Salafi movement, who would say there's no good bid'ah hasana, and those are a little bit more traditionalist. They would say you can break it down categorically, because Umar says when he brings people together, this is a good innovation. Does that make sense? That's what he's saying here. You can think about this categorically, but there's a base to it, and there's a base to the people who have the ability and authority to do this. That it's not just an everyday person. There's other hadith where the Prophet says that somebody who is a mujtahid of this scholar, of this religion, that they essentially have the capacity across being trained in numerous sciences, that if they were to exert a ruling of some kind, that there's a reward in that for them, and if they were to get it right, then there's 2 rewards in it. Because the idea is to struggle with it. But it assumes that some people could get certain things wrong. Does this make sense? Okay, let's keep reading. The second kind?
The second kind of innovation is one that is blameworthy only from the point of view of renunciation and contentment, such as the excessive use of illicit clothes, foodstuffs, and houses.
Okay, so this is something that is, like, again, rooted in hadith, right? Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that the first, hardship, the first bala that hits the community is they eat till their stomach is full. It wasn't a practice during the time of the Prophet that people ate to a point of overt satiation, that there wasn't a gluttonous type of behavior. Do you get what I mean? So the idea here is rooted now in the standpoint of what actually creates balance. And the excessive use of these things that they're mentioning is something that also becomes a preventative mode of finding inward gain. This is hadith. لَيْسَ الْغِنَى أَنْ كَثْرَةَ الْعَرَض وَلَكِنَّ الْغِنَى غِنَى النَّفْسِ. That true richness is not having an abundance of things of the earth, but true richness is having a richness of your soul. Can we continue the third kind?
The third kind is the absolute blameworthy innovation, which contradicts the provisions of the Book and Sunnah, or the consensus of the nation. Innovators have fallen into this very frequently with regard to the principles, usul, but infrequently with regard to the branches, furu. The one who does not adhere exceedingly to the Book and Sunnah and does not do his utmost to emulate the messenger and then pretends that he has a certain degree before God, the Exalted, should not be paid attention to nor attended, even if he is able to fly in the air and walk on water, and have distances folded up, and the laws of nature broken for him. This happens frequently to demons, magicians, soothsayers, talisman makers, astrologers, and others who are similar in error. These can only be considered charismata, karamat, and confirmation, and not enticements and delusions when rectitude is istiqama is present in the one in whom they appear.
So what Imam Al-Haddad is saying here is that just because somebody has like certain capacities to do certain things, if they are people you're going to take from, they can't be people who are living in contradiction to the Quran and the Sunnah if they're the ones teaching you their Islam. Does that make sense? Understanding what this means, though, necessitates understanding like what it means to follow the Sunnah. Following the Sunnah doesn't mean that you have to wear one of these every day, right? None of you are even wearing it. I'm the only one wearing it, and I'm wearing it because I live upstairs. I got pajama pants on underneath this. I'm really comfortable. You're in a place where a recognition of this, again, does not become devoid of an understanding of who you are. To be Muslim is not to commit a cultural apostasy of some kind. It's not to become Arab. Does that make sense? But if you want to see where and how something is related to this concept, there has to be evidentiary basis to it, right? It's a system that is rooted not in I think, I want, I feel, but it has to have some type of basis as to why you do what you do. And just because you don't do it doesn't mean that that's not a part of something still. Do you get what I mean? You can struggle with it, and that's okay. Just say, I struggle with it. I'm not ready to do this. It's not easy. It's hard for me. I don't get it. I'm trying to figure it out. That's a part of the journey. It's a part of the process. But this third form of it is one that becomes a challenge. Usul is kind of the principles of Islamic law, Islamic legal theory. So the way you have the word fiqh, which essentially relates to like rulings, you know, what usul does is it sets the parameters through which the fiqh is determined, right? So you have basketball players that play a game and the referees tell you what the conditions of the game are and how to play it. That's the relationship between people who practice and understand Islamic legal theory and the end result of the legal rulings. Do you get what I mean? And so there's different methodologies in terms of what is implemented, and you'll have different opinions rooted in different legal theories. So somebody might say, hey, you know what? We don't make dua altogether at the end of a prayer. And then somebody might say, it's really good to make dua altogether at the end of a prayer. And their opinions are based on evidences, but the methodology that yields the opinion is rooted in distinct aspects of legal theories. Does that make sense? So if you walk into a masjid, and it can be really off-putting, right? I don't know if any of you have ever been to Pakistan before. I used to grow up going to Pakistan a lot. You can walk into some masjids, you don't have something covering your head, they will not let you into the masjid. I've seen guys walk into masjids and they literally tie like table handkerchiefs on their head just because the people in the masjid, they're not down to have anybody walk in because they're like, this is it and that's the only way. That's not what a masjid is supposed to be like. Houses of God are meant to be spaces where anybody can come in and out. That's what the paradigm of divine gatherings are rooted in. Can you guys give me 1 second? Why don't we do this? If you just turn to the people next to you, what do you take? Never mind, I lost it. I just don't know if it's the pizza guy. So, you want to think about it in this way. He's calling back. Hello? Are you downstairs? Okay, thank you. He's going to be here in 5 minutes. He's just leaving from the place right now. If you want to go down in 5 minutes. Yeah, thanks, guys. So, here, it's something that it might be unfamiliar, right? You go to some masjids, when they pray, they say Ameen after Fatiha. In other places, they don't. They're both valid. That's not what we're talking about here. There's some people who they consider prayer in the middle of the month of Sha'ban as a virtuous night of worship. There's others who won't. They have bases to these things. There's differences at this level. That's why you want to just try your best. And when you walk in, just because it's not the way you do it, doesn't mean that that's not the way that it should be done. The other part to this that's really important, in recognizing what this concept of bid'ah means, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he preferred gatherings of knowledge over gatherings that were just purely devotional. So there's hadith where the Prophet would walk into a space and there's a gathering of dhikr and there's a gathering of ilm, and he would go and sit in the gathering of knowledge. You have to know things, and it has to be a part of your regular practice. And if you don't know what the book says, that's okay, but just yield to that. You don't know what it says, then don't talk so much about it. Do you see where that's a problem? And this concept here goes in other directions, right? Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, he has a khutbah that they just put up on the oceans of knowledge or something like this. It's really great. You should listen to it. He has a point in there where he mentions that even the seriousness of this is not taken lightly on a grammatical level, where there were scholars who would seek forgiveness because their grammar was off in the kind of recitation of a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And why would they be afraid of that is because they would say there's hadith where the Prophet says if somebody attributes something to me that I didn't say, then that's like a place for them in Jahannam. May Allah protect us from it, right? So it's a serious thing, this thing of bid'ah, but it's not something that it gets turned into. And the mode through which you know what is part of this religion is you just learn the religion. You don't stop learning it when you're 6, or when you stop going to Sunday school, or you don't just learn the 2 do's and don'ts, but you start to learn it now in a way where it's experienced. You learn it in every facet of yourself. You think deeply about it. You reflect on it. You contemplate upon it. And you can start to see from people who live in contradiction. So as he continues on page 38, he says, Abu Yazid al-Bistami once went to visit a man who was said to be a wali. He sat down waiting for him in a mosque until the man came out and spat on the wall of the mosque, at which Abu Yazid went away without speaking to him. He said, how can one be entrusted with God's secrets who is not careful to maintain the courtesies of the law? Does that make sense? Like, somebody's going to tell you they know this deen, but they don't have adab. Then how do they know the deen? The Prophet says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that I was sent to just perfect good conduct. He also says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمٍ, that I was sent to be a teacher. These things go hand in hand. Ethics can be situational, but conduct can also be learned. And so somebody's telling you, hey, come learn from me, but they're acting in contradiction to the prophetic sunnah of good character and moral behavior and ethics. And that's somebody that you want to distinguish between being a professor versus being a teacher. You see the difference? You can take information from people, but you don't want to take their characteristics if what they're calling to you are things that are deeply problematic in this way. Al-Junayd rahimahullah has said, all roads are blocked except to him who follows in the footsteps of the messengers sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Sahil ibn Abdullah, may God have mercy on him, has said, there is no helper but Allah, no guide but the messenger of Allah, no provision but taqwa, and no work but to have fortitude in these things. Everything goes back to the Quran and the Sunnah. Everything. Everything has to go back to these sources. If somebody tells you something and you act on misinformation, that's a challenge, but at some level you got to put in the effort to learn from what is reliable and authentic. And when you don't, you're putting yourself in that place where it can be a challenge. Do you see what I mean? So when I sit down with people and they say to me that I don't have to pray Fajr on time, I'm like, why don't you tell me? Because it's hard. Like, why? Right? It's just really late. Fajr's really early in the middle of summer. What do you know that I don't know that I don't have to wake up to pray Fajr at this time? And they said, my mom told me when I was little that if you don't wake up to pray Fajr, you just wake up and you pray 2 rak'ahs of the Subh prayer, and it's the same as Fajr. And I said, I'm sure your mother's a lovely woman, but that's not from the Quran and the Sunnah. You got to pray Fajr in its time. So can we take a minute? You can turn to the people next to you. What are you taking away from this so far? We can talk it out and then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things we're taking away so far? What is this bringing up for you? What is it making you think about? Who wants to start? All right, did you raise your hand? Yeah. What were you talking about? You weren't talking about what you're supposed to. What were people talking about? Who wants to start?
Well, I was saying that it can be really difficult to get, correct information about Islam when you feel that when it's hard to find a scholar that you can truly trust and that you feel has your best intentions at heart, and that don't immediately come at you with a hostility. Like if you come and you say something that's, wrong, or you have a question, and instead of being met with, "Astaghfirullah, sister, what's wrong with you?" Maybe being patient, slowing down, and, giving compassion and guidance.
Yeah, and this is where there's a relationship between what he's saying. If somebody doesn't act like the prophet of God, they're not kind. Like, be mindful of this, right? There's hadith where a man comes to the prophet and gives him a gift of a bottle of liquor. Like, he gives the messenger of God a bottle of alcohol. And the Prophet ﷺ he, is like, I can't take the alcohol, right? He doesn't hammer down on him, do you know? And so the man tells the person who's with him, who works for him, well, just take it and, sell it to somebody. The Prophet's like, sorry, you can't do that either, right? But he doesn't get upset with him, right? The person who converts to Islam, and he says, teach me something, O Messenger of God. And the Prophet says, when you hear someone sneeze, say, Yarhamakullah. This is a right that they have over you. And then they stand to pray Asr. This guy just became Muslim. And while they're praying, someone sneezes. And he learned from the Prophet, when somebody sneezes, you say, Yarhamakullah. So he said, Yarhamakullah out loud. And everybody starts looking at him in the prayer. And he gets uncomfortable because people are staring at him. And he says out loud again, why are you looking at me? And then the hadith says they start to hit the inner parts of their thighs to get him to indicate to stop talking. And he stops talking, but he feels terrible. And at the end of the prayer, he says, I swear to God, Muhammad is the best of teachers. He did not revile me, he did not repudiate me, he did not scold me. He simply said to me that in the course of this prayer, we are reciting the words of God. It's not appropriate to mix them with other words. They both got him to know you don't talk in prayer. One made him feel terrible, the other one let him believe he could still have a relationship with God. Do you understand? Religion can be really an easy thing to believe your own hype about. And you get to a place where it's super easy to lose sight of what the previous chapters talked about, where shaitan gets you to think that there's nothing that you do that's a problem just because you know something. There's individuals who are purely engaged in action without any knowledge. There's people who all they do is they have knowledge that they take in and they don't do anything with it. Both of those are problematic. If you come to the fiqh class we do on Wednesday, we've been looking at Surah Fatiha, and this is what explanation is. When you make this dua, Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. The grammar here denotes not pointed out to me, but the grammar denotes that, Ya Allah, walk with me through it. Go with me hand in hand. There's a gentle presence of God there. And when that sirat is described, sirat alladhina an'amta alayhim, the path of those who have already gotten your blessing. One of the explanations of this, because this entire chapter is about knowledge and action, is an'amta alayhim are those people who they have knowledge and they act on what they know. غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, not those that have anger towards them. They're the ones who know things and they don't do anything with what they know. وَلَا الضَّالِينَ, those who are lost, they're the ones who don't know anything and they're still trying to do stuff. So the dua you make every day is to be the people who know and act on what you know. That's what you're asking for. But it's got to translate into something, just to like small steps. You don't have to take big leaps all the time. It's not meant to be a hard religion. And when you talk to somebody who's a jerk, then don't let them be your teacher. Somebody can know things. It doesn't mean that they don't know something. Take their information, but distinguish them from being somebody who's just giving you concrete knowledge versus somebody who's teaching you how to live. Do you see? In the end of this chapter, this is what he talks about. That it's hard. This is what the Quran says. When you have a question, go ask people. You remember we were talking about the Quran some weeks ago. This becomes a hard part for a lot of us to read it, is because we don't know how to read it. Not because we don't know how to read the translation or understand the Arabic, but it's not a linear text. So the topics in and of themselves, where do I go to read it when I'm trying to figure out how to deal with healing of myself? Where do I go to read in the Quran when I have ethical dilemmas, when I have challenges of certain kinds? I'm trying to make decisions. And so you go and you build relationships and you ask people who know, and you engage as best as you can, but you also turn to your brothers and sisters. Because in lieu of people, it doesn't mean you just sit with yourself and you kind of just stew, and life is hard, and you get deeper into a hole. But you can turn to people sometimes. What made this man feel empowered is not the information he was given about not talking in prayer. What made him feel whole was the kindness that he received from the messenger that said, hey, like, you're still okay. You can do that for somebody. You can let them feel like they're still a part of it. Does it make sense? What else did we discuss? What else are you taking away so far? Yeah.
I discussed how this is a faith, or within the context of the question, it's something that requires a degree of humility and humbleness in your knowledge, because something that drew me to this faith was the constant pursuit of knowledge. Even if whether you're 9 or 90, there's still an opportunity to learn. And you don't know everything, so you should approach everything. So.
Yeah, man. And this humility piece is crazy important, because there's too many of us who are in this ummah who think we know something, but also assume that nobody else knows anything. You can learn something from everybody. You can. There's instances in the hadith where the Prophet gives indication that he might not be the person that you should be asking a question, right? Farmers come to the Prophet and ask about planting their harvest. He gives them some feedback. They follow his direction, they plant, nothing is yielded. They say to him, why did you tell us to do this? He says to them, why did you ask me? I'm not a farmer. Do you get what I mean? You go and ask somebody who's faqih a question, he's a jurist. He's not going to be able to tell you how to make your marriage work. You're going to ask somebody who's a theologian, something that's doctrinal. How are they going to tell you how to deal with a relationship that is going sour? That's not their training. I have teachers who are brilliant in Islamic legal theory. They spend some time of their life working in masjids, counseling children and married couples, and they had no choice because no one was hiring them for their skill, and they needed to feed their families. Other people that I've studied with who are brilliant in various sciences of religion, they have people that will come to ask them questions about graphic design and what should this poster look like. Why? Why would they be asked that question? What do they have as a basis to it? Do you get what I mean? So this point of asking the people who have remembrance is to also ask the right people the right questions. And this point of humility is important because not everybody is going to be comfortable in saying, I don't know. Imam Malik, rahimahullah, who was said to be the shining star of Medina, they say a person comes to ask him questions from as far as Spain and Medina, poses 40 questions to him, and to 36 he responds, I don't know. And they say, you're Imam Malik, you don't know? He says, I don't know. Why do you always have to have an answer to everything? Why do you always have to think somebody else doesn't know? Such condescension in your conveyance of it. And the excuses that are made are so stupid. Well, they're still saying the right thing even if it came across the wrong way. Statistically, the impact of communication is 7% rooted in content. 93% is non-verbalized. This is why it's important that the Messenger of God sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Innama bu'ithtu liyutammima makarim al-akhlaq." This is why the Quran says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. You were sent as a mercy for the worlds. So when you know something, don't assume that somebody else doesn't know anything. If your default is to suspect that somebody else is ignorant, then you're learning about yourself. This is why Ibn Ata'illah, who's a great scholar of our religion, he has a book called the Hikam, the aphorisms, the wisdoms. And one of them says that if you think you are not arrogant, you essentially are. Does it make sense? So be open to the idea that you can take from people. And if you get to a place where you're putting barriers that don't make sense, ask where those barriers are inwardly. Where can you gain? Where can you understand? Where can you take and learn from experiences? It's not going to always look the same. The Banu Arfida, people of Abyssinia, what we know as modern-day Ethiopia, they convert to Islam. There's a celebration that comes, and they start to dance. They have spears. It's like a military step dance, right? It's got a dignity to it. And in the course of it, they're singing songs about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet's telling them, keep going. Show people that there's latitude in this religion of ours. Umar ibn al-Khattab steps up to stop them, because what they're doing is not what is the custom of Quraysh. And the Prophet says, let them be, Umar. Let people see there's latitude in this deen of ours. Do you see the difference? And so let yourself talk to yourself in a way that doesn't assume that everybody else is stupid. Let yourself understand that when you fall into what we were talking about before, ideologies that influence your perspective, there's some of you in this room who believe that certain people are more intelligent simply because of the color of their skin. You might not admit it, but you take information differently in religion from somebody who is Arab versus somebody who is black. That's so ridiculous. Preventing yourself from access to the depth of beauty of scholarship in this religion. This is where humility comes in. There's some of us who won't take from people because of the deep accents that they have. There's a difference between education and entertainment. Do you get what I mean? Don't let shaitan take a little bit of information and get you to believe that you are bigger than everyone else. If you have the capacity to know, so do the people around you. And you be open. There is hadith where the Prophet doesn't know what to do, and he asks the people around him, what should I do? Hudaybiyah comes, and nobody's listening. They want to go for Hajj, and the Prophet has made an agreement in a treaty that we're not making Hajj this year. Umar ibn al-Khattab says, Alasna bil Muslimin wa alaysu bil mushrikeen. Are we not the Muslims and they're the mushriks? Why are we making deals with them? He goes to Abu Bakr and says the same thing. He says, don't you think the Prophet knows what to do? The Prophet has told people, slaughter your animals, remove your ihram, we're going back home. Nobody listens. He goes into his tent and he asks Salama, what should I do? And she says, you go and do it. If they see you do it, they're going to take it more seriously and they'll do the same thing. And he goes and he does what she tells him to do. Why is he asking somebody else what to do? He's the messenger of God, the last messenger of God. But there's still a basis to the fact that you need other people with you. Do you get what I mean? And the beauty of a deen that's a final testament is that it doesn't make distinctions based off of what society makes in arrogant modes of racist structures that implement your psyche and your perspective and think that you know better than somebody. Just because you're a man doesn't mean you're more intelligent than a woman. Just because you were born into Islam doesn't mean that you know better than someone who converted to it. Just because you can speak Arabic doesn't mean you know religion more than somebody who cannot. The default is to assume that you have growth and to practice husn al-dhan, think the best of others. And this point of humility is important. Any other thoughts on this? What are we taking away from here? So what you want to do is sit with some of this, right? The concept is in a spiritual text. your spiritual heart will not gain from engaging in practices that are religious and not found within the course of the Quran and the Sunnah. If your worship is not rooted in what is Quranic or prophetic, then there's not a basis to yield from it. It's the equivalent of what we said before. You're just making your own religion at that point. You're going to struggle with something, struggle with it. It's hard. Sometimes things are hard. May Allah grant you ease. We're all in it together. Just try your best. Be kind to one another. And you got to be kind to yourself. But you make a concerted effort to implement into your routine a regular practice. It doesn't have to be daily, but a regular practice where you're learning from the foundations up. Part of the adab of learning, the etiquette of ta'lim in our religion is revision. So you go back to what you learned before because you're in a different state now and you can understand it in the state that you're in. What does Fatiha mean to you? Do you know what the basic aspects of the religion are? Do you know what these terms mean? Sunnah, fard, haram, makruh, mustahab. And it's okay if you don't, so long as then you're just trying to engage in it and you're doing your best. You got to start somewhere, right? And it's a challenge when Islam gets intertwined with our cultural identities and our sociological identities. There's like a lot of blur and a lot of mix, and we just do and don't do because parents said this or elders said that. But you got to start to think about it and see where this thing comes. It's going to impact your heart. Because if you're doing something that's not rooted in something evidentiary, then you're also not using that time to do what it is that'll be uplifting for your heart, that is coming from text. Does that make sense?